Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest Urban Living webinar. Can I just check with my panelists that you can hear me? Because I'm not quite sure why we didn't have any sound with that video.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So today's subject, building for a net zero future, is a really important one. It's very high on the real estate agenda, and we are going to find a lot more about it today. My name's George Sell. I'm editor of Urban Living News, and we are an online B2B platform for the real estate and hospitality sectors. Today's webinar is going to last an hour. If you've got any questions, we'd like to make the session as interactive as we can, so please submit them using the Q&A or the chat function in Zoom. And if you've registered for the session, you'll get a link to a recording via email in the next couple of days. Now, this whole webinar series has been sponsored by Embodied Worldwide, and we're just going to watch a very short video to find out some more about them. Okay, thanks to Embodied Worldwide for sponsoring. If you'd like to find out more about them, you can see their contact details in the chat. There's going to be quite a lot of information posted in the chat during the session. So when we finish the webinar at 3 o'clock, we're just going to leave it open for a couple of minutes so you can take some notes from what's in there. So we've got a lot to get through today, but I just wanted to show a few slides. These are screen grabs from our Urban Living News website, just to give people a bit of an idea of some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today. So it ranges from standards and measuring, green finance and how that is offering more attractive terms for acquisitions, even some slightly left field things like new construction materials, hemp and so on. And if we go on to the next slide. Resident engagement and resident behaviours and the role that plays in reducing emissions. We've got the big real estate companies setting some quite ambitious net zero targets. Hines there with 2040. NREP has introduced quite an interesting internal carbon tax to speed up its progress towards net zero. So there's some interesting stuff going on out there. Apologies if I'm teaching you to suck eggs here, but I just thought it was worth looking at these UK Green Building Council definitions just briefly before we get stuck in. So net zero carbon construction is when the amount of carbon emissions associated with a building's product and construction stages up to completion is zero or negative through the use of offsets or the net export of on-site renewable energy. And then operational energy, net zero, when the amount of carbon emissions associated with the building's operational energy on an annual basis is zero or negative. So, having established that, we will move on and meet our speakers. And I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves quickly, and we'll go from left to right as we see them on the screen. So first of all, Jade, good afternoon to you.
Afternoon, thanks very much for having me on today. So my background, been at Colliers coming up to 2 years in early next year, and work within the operational capital markets team. So kind of the key point there being operational is covering investments with an operational business in place, specifically focusing on build to rent, co-living and student accommodation. So my background was actually more office sector focused, and had the opportunity when I joined Colliers to kind of move over to the living sector. Could see a lot of the capital coming this way, so I thought it was an excellent opportunity post-COVID to do the same, and kind of a very interesting space to be in at the moment.
Thank you, Jade. And next we've got Brent. Good afternoon to you.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me. So I'm Brent Stojanovic. I'm a co-founder and director of VervLife. We are a third-party consultant and operator primarily focused on build-to-rent, co-living and single-family rental product across the UK. Prior to that, I was a director in Jones Lang LaSalle's property and asset management team for about 4 years.
Thank you, Brent. Théo, welcome to you.
Hi, George. Thank you for the intro. So I'm working for Deepki, which is an ESG SaaS company for tracking the ESG performance of the real estate markets. It's been 9 years that we've been operating this mission, and we are taking the overall journey, I will say, to reach out net zero targets from the data collection of utilities consumption and carbon performance to the implementation of CapEx plan in the end on large scale portfolio. So we have a platform that have a lot of tools to do so, but we are also providing services on every steps of this journey to our dear customers. So happy to be there.
Thank you, Théo. And last but not least, Simon, good afternoon to you.
Hi, afternoon, George and everyone. Pleasure to be here with you and on this afternoon. My name's Simon. I'm Head of Research and Advisory Services for the Urban Land Institute in Europe. And for those that don't know, the ULI is a member-driven organization comprising around 50,000 members globally across the real estate sector with a focus on shaping the future of the built environment. And then prior to working at ULI, I used to be in the research team at Grosvenor, so focusing on the future of global cities. And yeah, pleasure to be here. And it's a very interesting discussion to be part of.
Thank you, Simon. And if you look in the chat, you can see the LinkedIn profiles of our speakers. So if you'd like to carry on the conversation with them after the session, then drop them a line on there. So the net zero agenda, it's high profile, it's in the news everywhere, but I'm keen to establish to start the session off who's actually driving it, who are the prime movers here. Is it governments, is it investors, is it end users? Or is it a mixture of all of them? Simon, can I start with you on that one?
Sure, yes, happy to kick things off. So as you say, George, it is very much high profile agenda and everyone talks about it from across the public, private sector, occupiers. And I would say it is a multi-pronged approach and no one organization or institute is driving it. You can't deny that to some extent the governments and public sector are playing a role here. We have COP convening at the end of the month in Dubai, right, in terms of discussing this kind of more global policy level. And so there is some advancement being made there. But then if you look from a kind of real estate perspective, I think a lot more effort is being driven more by the companies themselves, investors, developers, and ultimately occupiers. There's no doubt that this is such a big, important issue for our sector. If you look at some of the recent IPCC reports, they specifically flag real estate and the built environment as one of the key sectors that is one that needs to be decarbonized. We all know the key stats, 40% of greenhouse gas emissions coming from the built environment or real estate. So there's definite efforts here. And as you showed in one of your slides previously, George, a lot of companies are beginning to make grand statements, right, in terms of commitments to be in net zero for different timeframes. So these tend to span from 2030, 2040, 2050 beyond. So there is definite kind of progress being made here. Although, interestingly, there was a study done earlier this year that did a deeper dive into the top 75 institutional real estate investors globally. And over half of those have made no commitment to decarbonize their real estate portfolio. So there's still a big gap there. If you think about it, that half of the top 75, that represents, trillions of dollars of investment in the real estate sector. So while it's really good to see companies like Hines and NREP really at the vanguard in the sector, I still feel there's a lot of progress to be made. And just to wrap up on the occupier side, this can be a driver as well. I think occupiers are putting a lot more pressure on real estate companies now. Particularly, we've seen recent years more on the operational side, so energy efficiency. That's when we saw that recent spike in energy prices really hitting the bottom line and the P&L of companies. When they're looking at kind of lease renewals and their rents, they are factoring in the energy costs. So some of it will be driven by the occupiers, but so it is happening, but it is multi-pronged, like I said, and so it's all the actors are being involved at different stages.
That's quite a startling statistic that you mentioned there at the number of investors, Simon, and we're going to move on later in the session to talk about how sustainability and readiness for net zero affects asset value. And you've got to think that lack of action is going to return and bite some of them in the backsides at some point, but we'll move on to that later. Théo, did what Simon was saying kind of chime with your experience? I mean, if we say the journey to net zero is 100 miles long, which mile are we at as a and it's a blunt question, but and obviously some are further on than others, but in general, have we still got a long way to go?
It's actually a good question that we ask ourselves today and every day at Deepki, in basically how do we support our customers in this journey? So where do we stand in this journey? And I completely agree with Simon on this aspect, is that there is a huge margin of progress, I will say. But still, we have observed a kind of tipping point a few years ago where customers used to come to Deepki to track data, and we observed the market was really about the data. Today, it's also about the data, but it's more about action. And the main request we have from new customers or existing customers is how do we leverage this data to take action, which means that there is a movement in this direction, which is a good news, but still the change is huge and the journey is long. Two aspects on this, I think that the market has a bit understood the problem and the challenge, I will say. And if I may, Simon, I will quote your study on this. I think that if I read it carefully, the main concern for 2024 are first the capex and then the sustainability requirement for the assets. So I think that the market understood the priority of this. Still, it's super difficult to reach net zero performance for an asset. And we conducted a study a few months ago at Deepki, and we were basically asking the markets and market players their expectation and their anticipation of their performance in 20 years. And what we observe is that only a minority of players expect today to have the majority of their assets to be neutral by 2050, which is dramatic, and we need to address this. Of course, if you take the big picture, the market anticipates that the good share of their portfolio will be carbon neutral by 2050, but it means that to end this journey, we need to tackle the most difficult one and anticipate the most difficult one, because it's not only about refurbishing a building, it's how do you refurbish a building, taking into account the occupier of this building. And for the living sectors, we know that it's very, very difficult to implement a very efficient strategy for refurbishment that is cost effective, taking into account the occupier of the building.
Yeah, thank you, Théo. Simon, I was at MIPIM last year and I heard a talk from Lisette Van Doorn of ULI, and one of the things that she mentioned was that legislation is probably likely to be the most effective way to accelerate the journey to net zero. And going back to your figure about the number of owners, investors who are dragging their feet, that would appear to be a very necessary move. What are the most significant pieces of current or future legislation across the sector in Europe that's affecting this journey?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, as Théo said, the ones that are making most progress here are the ones that see the writing on the wall, right? They know this is coming eventually, so they're getting ready for it. I think a lot of the real estate companies across Europe now face this whole plethora of an alphabet soup of legislation and regulation and policies, right? We've all heard these acronyms, and I don't know, not everyone knows exactly what they do or what they cover. The EU taxonomy, SFDR, TCFD. I mean, it's all great, and it is kind of helping steer the industry to some extent. Some of it is mandatory, others is kind of voluntary at this stage. For the ULI, us as an organization, and speaking to our members across the board, the biggest game changer we feel from a legislation and regulation point of view would be carbon pricing. And you had something up there around carbon taxes.
Yeah.
some in the industry think this is inevitable. It's going to come down the line, and they are making progress. I think you mentioned the one there using shadow pricing, right? So that is, in a way, getting people educating themselves and putting a price on the carbon emissions, whether operational or embodied. And so they can factor that into their valuations. At the moment, you know, and ULI said this at Georgia at MIPIN about there's basically a effectively a carbon bubble in real estate valuations, right? And no valuations are really effectively factoring in the cost of, you know, getting buildings up to compliance that need to be. And we are seeing some progress there, but in order to drive it, a carbon pricing or carbon tax will be the most effective mechanism. We're beginning to see some progress in this way from a kind of either kind of EU level, so multi kind of bodies. So from 2026, I think the EU are introducing a carbon import tax, and this will affect things like steel and concrete and other materials for construction. So that will then play into the calculations and finances for doing new build versus retrofit. The other element is happening more at kind of city level. So in New York, for example, there's a law called Local Law 97, which is kind of factoring in a carbon price on buildings that are over a certain amount of square footage or square meters. So things are happening. And then on the company side, they're starting to put shadow pricing or putting which some of them just do it hypothetically to assess the cost of what effectively would be a carbon tax or a carbon price, but then others are then applying that already and then allocating it to an internal kind of decarbonization fund, which they can then use to either retrofit and repurpose their buildings or put into carbon offset schemes. So from ULI's perspective is going to be the biggest game changer for the industry.
Excellent. Thank you, Simon. Jade, how is the living sector performing? And when I say living sector, I basically mean student PBSA, build to rent, later living, co-living. How is that particular group of use classes performing compared with other areas of commercial real estate?
Sure. So I'd say on the whole, compared to more traditional asset classes, because it's more of a newer kind of sector, you would hope that sustainability and kind of ESG is on the forefront of most kind of developers' minds. I think given the kind of huge demand and lack of supply, a lot of the sector is still kind of ground up developments, and where there is kind of retrofitting and first generation stock being looked at, given the kind of wider macro headwinds at the moment, a lot of strategies have kind of been focused on value add with an ESG angle. So kind of the ground up developments are being kind of ESG is already at the forefront, and then with the kind of first generation, you are kind of having that ESG consideration with your retrofit and refurbishment.
Thanks, Jade. And Théo, presumably at Deepki, you're monitoring buildings across a whole range of different asset classes. What's your take on how the living sector is performing compared with others?
That's a very good question, because our job at Deepki is to develop the software and get data into this software, which means that today we are tracking consumption for 100,000 buildings, I would say, in 52 countries. So we managed to get a macro view of the actual performance of the different property types we have in Europe. And we've built this ESG index, which is kind of annual benchmark for which we publish the observed figures we have for the average performance of energy performance for those typical class. What we observe for the living sector that we class into the residential assets, because it's multifamily assets, co-living and student housing are sharing the kind of the same characteristic for energy performance, is that there is strong differences from one country to another that are related to different history in terms of urban planning, refurbishment strategy at national scale, and so on. But what is super interesting is to see the evolution of this consumption for the residential sector between 2021 to 2022. And what we observe is that there is, like for other property types, a downward trends in the evolution of consumption. which is not related necessarily to an increase in energy performance. It's purely, well, mainly related to the climate, I will say, which is warmer. But there is also, we think, a cost effect, meaning that those property types are the most exposed to the risk of the cost of the energy, because their occupiers are the most exposed as well to the building of those energy. So that's why we explain probably that the decrease in consumption from 2021 to 2022 is higher for residential assets, because you have a combination of first the climate, of course, but also the exposure to the cost of energy, which is directly related to the actual performance of the building, because the worse performance is your building, the most exposed you are to the evolution of the cost of energy, which relates again to the fact that you need to take into account the occupier in your refurbishment strategy, because it will be clearly something that needs to be taken into account in the coming years, as we expect the energy price to rise. And for occupier, like you said, Jade, we have clearly a problem of offer for this sector. So it means that the occupiers are more exposed to this problem as well for living sectors.
Thanks, Théo. Brent, we've spoken about owners and investors. We haven't really touched on operators yet. What is the operator's role in this net zero journey, and how is it evolving?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say, George, is it's a critical one. It's an important one. Obviously, once the building's been developed and constructed, the keys then get passed to the operator, and it all becomes about operational efficiency, and really, as an operator, getting the asset into a place whereby it can support and ultimately meet the client's targets relating to carbon, climate, and more broadly ESG. And I think look, we're a third-party operator rather than a vertically integrated owner operator as distinct. So what that means for us is, I sort of see it as our role as a business, really primarily to support the client, whether that's an investor or a developer, or indeed both, to meet their own ESG strategies, rather than have a distinct set in stone ESG strategy ourselves as a business. So for us, it's more about a kit of parts. It's about absolutely having a direction of travel, but it's about having a toolbox of tools and approaches and initiatives, which on a site-by-site basis you can roll out, given that specific location and that specific client, in order to help the client meet their own ambitions. So I think it's all about flexibility, particularly as a third-party operator. A big part of that for us is about supporting our clients with understanding, you know, what their ESG mandates mean on a granular asset by asset on the ground level, and really supporting them to demystify it. Okay, you know, we live in a world where clearly investors and developers, you know, any good one worth their salt, clearly will have progressive targets when it comes to climate and carbon. But actually, what does that mean on the ground, and how are assets managed? How are residents educated? How are residents encouraged? Because of course there has to be an alignment of interests to support the client to meet those targets. So I think it's multifaceted, it's complex, it's about getting ahead of the challenge wherever possible. So a big part of our consultancy with clients at all stages of the life cycle prior to stabilized occupation is about making sure the right building management systems are specified, supporting clients to choose technologies that will help them to track and manage energy and carbon, for example. So that's a big part of it. I think during operation, we've moved towards a place where we're pursuing what we might call, and I'm not going to win any points for originality with this statement, but sustainability is standard. Okay, so what that means is, for example, illustratively, every time we take on an asset, we're building an energy survey. Okay, and we do that as part of the course to understand how these buildings are operating from an efficiency point of view, where are the gaps, and how can we as an operator actually work up into asset management to support our clients to remedy those inefficiencies, help them to quantify that in terms of potential asset value and income, and operating costs, leakage, and then all crack on and get the job done, really. So yeah, I think as an operator, there's a lot to think about.
And sticking with you for the minute, Brent, what's the role of technology in enabling you to do that? And are there any kind of new technological advances or developments that are either imminent or, you know, in the medium term that you think are going to make the job easier?
I think my personal view is we're in a really good place when it comes to building technology, specifically with regards to tracking energy and understanding carbon and climate. Clearly, you know, the sector will continue to innovate, and so it should. But I actually think there's some really, really good technology out there that helps operators to understand carbon, understand climate, environmental impact, and then report that back to their clients. I actually think that the trick is not necessarily which technology you use. I think you need to use the right technology. It's sort of a universally understood statement, but I actually think it's about what you do with the data and how you calculate that and present it to the client. So I think that's a big part of what we focus on as an operator is, yeah, absolutely making sure the right technology is in place, but then what are you doing with the data, right? Because ultimately data is just data. It's just words, it's just numbers, it's how you interpret and deliver on the data that tends to make the difference. So, you know, making sure, again, I come back to it, demystification, really important word, you know, making sure that all of our recommendations are presented to clients in a really simple to understand way. We're dealing with asset managers, typically asset directors. They're not sustainability experts. They'll have sustainability experts in the team, but again, it's a question of getting the right information to the right people and compelling people to act on it. So I think yeah, technology really important, but you know, how are you as an operator interacting with that technology in order to ensure your buildings and portfolios are more efficient.
Thank you, Brent. And Théo, as a tech supplier, what are you seeing that's around the corner that's going to make everybody's job easier along this net zero journey?
I could not agree more with what you just said, Brent. The technology is there. We are sure that you can track the energy and the carbon KPIs of every assets you want like to have today. It's possible. You have the technology with Deepki, for instance, but it's possible. The way we build the application is around the framework data, insight, action. And it's really the combination of those three pillars that makes you having impact on your assets, because of course you need to have data to analyze your performance, but then you need to be able to analyze this data, and it's directly related to what you just said, giving the right information to the right person at the right moment to make sure that you can do something with this, which is the action, to really have a data-driven strategy for improving the impact on your assets. And then the key is really to use this technology to, at every step of this journey, prioritize your action, prioritize your effort, and prioritize in the end your CapEx. You need to prioritize the action on the data to make sure that you get as much data as possible, the quickest as possible, to make sure you can start the analysis. Then you refine your data collection to refine the analysis of the data, but you need to start very quickly with the data. And then when it's come to the action, you also need to prioritize your action, because given the time period that we have to address this topic, you need to tackle the right asset at the beginning. And if you build a strategy to refurbish your building, you need to think about long term. You need to respect a sequence of strategy of action to make sure that you maximize your impact for every euro you invest in your assets. Because if you start with the wrong action for the wrong assets, it means that in the end, you will have assets that will have oversized equipment at the end of the process, because you will have changed the heating system first without reduce the energy need of the buildings and so on, which means that it's not efficient, it will cost more, and you will have lose time in your effectiveness. So that's why I completely agree. The technology is there, is how to use it and to prioritize your action at every steps of this. And that's why we provide services also, because it's difficult at the beginning to implement the data collection, making sure you identify your right action to implement. And then it's about using this data and building investment plan on large scale portfolio with the right approach, a consistent approach that will give you impact in the future is not that easy also. So that's why we are providing services to our customers, is to make sure that we can build a plan, which is a long-term strategy, respecting the good sequence for maximizing the impact. And then we give this plan to our customers that go refine it asset by asset. But the technology is definitely there.
Thank you, Théo. Let's move on and talk a bit about resident behaviour and how that affects building performance. I think this is something which is particularly relevant to the living sector. You know, in some asset classes like co-living, you have all-inclusive bills and so on. Jade, let's start with you. How significant an impact does end user behaviour have on a building's performance in the living sector? You know, especially compared with other asset classes.
Yeah, so I think it's completely crucial. So the way that occupiers interact with the building, it influences the environmental footprint, the social impact, and kind of the overall governance of the building. And kind of assuming that the building enables these behaviours, it's kind of up to the residents within to kind of carry that through, create that culture. Obviously, the energy waste and kind of water will make up majority of that impact, and that's where kind of the technology and data comes in handy. But it's kind of educating and communicating and having that community involvement of that end user behaviour that will really kind of influence that overall lifestyle choice. And that's kind of where you can carry it through the life cycle of the building. I think on the student side, a really simple example is kind of opening windows triggers the heating or the cooling turning off. And that's kind of a building design, but it's kind of supporting that hand in hand with the behaviour of the occupiers.
There was a study done quite recently, and I can't remember the exact specifics, but it was it was for a student asset, and it was showing the residents that if they turned their thermostats down by 1 or 2 degrees, how much carbon they could save over the course of the year, and it was quite staggering. And once they'd been shown that, actually their behaviours did change quite quickly. You know, they did engage. Brent, whose role is it to do this educational piece with the end user? Is that the operator's job?
Yes and no, insofar as that can be a viable answer to any question. I think you know we're in the realms of civic responsibility here. Is what I would say. I think you know it's an individual's own watch out and look out to do the right thing by the planet. Whether they're in an office building or in their own home, I deeply believe in that as a fundamental principle. I think as an operator, clearly you have a role. I think it's about education for sure. But I think quite often, and this is basic human psychology, you know, as an operator, you know, if you tell residents to do things, quite often they'll do the opposite, right? Just to be frank. So I think what's really interesting here is co-living, right? In a world where, you know, it's de rigueur, as I'm sure we all recognise at this stage of co-living is still nascent development in the UK, to offer all inclusive rents, including utilities, right? So you know, I think you know, when it comes to residents and members, or you might call them in co-living, you know, really working on the base of members / residents, it is super important because they don't just have an impact on usage and carbon, but clearly, you know, they have a financial impact on the NOI, because the landlord and or the operator is exposed to the cost, right, of said utilities. So I think that's really important. What we found more effective, I think, than telling residents to switch the lights off, is for example working within the members community to take a more organic person-to-person approach, and what that might mean, for example, is it works particularly well on co-living due to the demographics typically in evidence. On our co-living schemes, we might have a cohort of, you know, they may be called resident or member champions, for example. So, you know, on a 200-bed scheme, you know, you could have 3 or 4 of these members, people that live there. You know, they may or may not get incentivized to perform that role, but you know, money off the rent or incentivized in other ways. But I think it's really important to work with those people to really act as the voice and as the champion for making the right, sustainable decisions within the rest of the members community. And I think if you can work with members to help them help themselves and to help them make the right decisions themselves, that is a much more effective approach than you know, really stringently enforcing fair use policies. Fair use policies are really, really important. There should always be a fair use policy in place. I'm not decrying fair use policies, but it's not, you know, it's again about a kit of things that you will do, rather than just relying, for example, on a fair use policy, which is in effect a document.
Thank you, Brent. Thanks. Simon, I think it's fair to say across the living sector to now, a majority of the assets we're talking about have been new builds, but with the embodied carbon debate and a shift in planning policies in a lot of countries and cities to prioritize refurbs over new builds, do you think that's a policy which is going to affect the development process across the living sector?
Yes, potentially. And I mean, a lot of we're starting to see in some cities across Europe now, some local authorities or city authorities are taking a kind of retrofit first approach to any new developments that go through a planning permission process. And so this will definitely have an impact in terms of the living sector. There's obviously a big discussion around kind of change of use, and office to resi obviously is a widely discussed area. That's a whole nother topic and a whole probably another webinar in itself in terms of the office to resi. But if we just touch on that briefly, there's elements there around, you know, taking that as looking at assets and whether it's the change of use, is the functional demand there, the shortage and demand supply imbalance of residential across many desirable urban areas is clearly still there. There's challenges there in terms of the fit out and the, you know, floor to ceiling ratios and all that kind of elements, but that could play a role in terms of steering investment towards those where it does work on a viable, but it often has to be considered on an asset by asset case. And so it's definitely like an area I think that will become at the forefront. At the moment, without that kind of stick approach in terms of a carbon tax or anything around a carbon pricing, then ultimately it will come down to, you know, what works in terms of the financials and actually what can get it through in terms of the planning permission. But I see it's something to keep your eye on and something to be aware of in the wider kind of residential and living sector. And as Jade alluded to earlier, a lot of the in transaction volumes are shifting towards the living sector, driven by further kind of structural change, tapping into demographic shifts and other high growth sectors like purpose built student housing, co-living, as Brent said, and then also on the older side as well, senior living and assisted living as well. So a lot of we're going to see more capital be allocated to that area, and then this will form a part of it in terms of that, looking at new build versus retrofit as well.
Jade, are you starting to see this swing of the pendulum towards conversions as opposed to new build assets in the living sector? Are we kind of at the start of that process, do you think?
Yeah, so I'd say we're working more closely with our office team than ever before, but more in kind of those key city locations that there's a lot of kind of offices next in key transport hubs, next to high streets and retail, where obviously with the kind of the office market not performing as well as it used to, it's kind of been obvious conversion. But again, it comes down to planning policy, the kind of individually from our experience, council by council, depends on their kind of receptiveness of things like co-living, and if they kind of understand it. Although saying that, I know that there's been kind of a recent guidance released now after a year consultation period, kind of given specific to the London guidance plan of purpose-built shared living, and that will help massively kind of improve that kind of consent rate. But it's kind of whether that cost and kind of the viability stacks up. I know that we looked at a few schemes from a development perspective on the commuter belt just outside of London, all kind of outlined or consented for BTR, and then the kind of dual core staircase was introduced, and they were no longer viable from just a construction cost perspective. But shifting it and now kind of looking at it from a co-living perspective, given the high density of units, it kind of stacks up a lot better. So whilst it's not kind of directly transferable, there is a lot of nuances in each of the kind of living, kind of purpose-built living and shared living that we can kind of utilise.
Thanks, Jade. Théo, is the capex needed to convert an existing building to one of these living uses? How does that stack up against the cost of a new build? And you know, are the economies of scale of the technology and the materials needed to convert the building? Does that mean the prices for conversions are coming down while new build prices are going up?
Well, obviously, transformer buildings usually cost more than could cost more than just building a new assets. But that's why it's super interesting to integrate the cost of carbon of doing this, because it's like for everything. What's difficult is really the last mile of the process. So if you want to target carbon neutrality, it means that you need to be accountable for every kilogram of CO2. And then given the carbon footprint of every ton of concrete, it means clearly that it's not valuable if you have a price for the carbon. It's not reliable. It's not valuable to go with a new building, because you want to avoid as much as possible. Just taking the example of concrete, you want to as much as possible to produce more concrete. So yeah, it's about putting the right priorities and valorizing in terms of economics, valorizing the carbons to make this operation more profitable in terms of life cycle analysis, I will say. If you look at the full operation of the building from the construction to the operation, you need to take into account the embodied carbon, and therefore to recognize the cost of carbon associated with new buildings. When it's come to economies of scale, it's a difficult question. The answer that we have today is that getting back to this needs of prioritization, one way to find economies of scale is clearly to think your strategy as your portfolio level, meaning that you need to gather all the assets that share the same characteristics into a bucket. And when I say sharing the same characteristic is not necessarily about the building typologies or is it what is the construction date. It's also about other attributes that could be the precise location of an asset. Because if you want to integrate the cost of refurbishments, it's not the same to refurbish an asset that is in the central district, financial central district of a city, than an asset that is in a suburb. Just for a simple reason, it costs more to bring the materials into the central district. It's way more difficult to have large scale work in the central business district. So if you want to find economies of scales, you need to think like this, with archetypes of building, cluster of building that share the same characteristics. So you can roll out investment plans that are actually sharing the same priorities for a bunch of assets. And this is where you can find economies of scale. But then, don't get me wrong, it costs to refurbish an asset, and this needs to be anticipated as well. There is no magic solution, and that's why it's also about the market that anticipate this. I think that the market has clearly understood that the quantity of capex that will need to be invested in the market in the coming years it's absolutely huge. And that's why we need to count for the price of CO2. It's one way to engage the market in this transition, because otherwise it's really difficult.
Thank you, Théo. Jade, we've been hearing a lot about green finance and how financial terms can be more advantageous if you're looking for, say, development finance or finance to acquire an asset. If that asset or if that project meets a lender's green criteria, can you tell us a bit about how advantageous these financial terms can be? How much more attractive is the financing if you can meet those criteria?
Yes, I think so. We, within our kind of investment team, have an operational debt team specifically that sit next to us, so it's kind of helpful to see it kind of firsthand. But I'd say that while it's become kind of a tick box for most lenders now to kind of have that EPC BREEAM ratings and kind of those sustainable metrics, we have seen in some cases that it can kind of reduce the terms or improve kind of the overall rate of financing. For example, so kind of a case study, we went to market recently on something with two main banks, and they came back to say that if we could kind of improve these certain metrics of the building, that it would be classed as a green loan, which would overall reduce the margin kind of by 20 to 25 basis points. So there can be kind of more tangible examples, but in general, it's just kind of like sustainability is at the forefront of everyone's mind. It's a crucial point to be considered. I would say as well that it's not always kind of just about the superior terms, but it's kind of more having that long-term view and the cost of capital, and kind of having more impact and control over the income of your building, which comes down to the operational efficiency of the building, and kind of having, when things like there's an energy crisis and you kind of have more overview in sight, it can kind of impact the covenants within your terms with your lenders. So it's kind of the full cycle.
And the flip side of that, Jade, is obviously a highly efficient asset is becoming more valuable, and an inefficient asset is becoming less valuable. Is that kind of green premium in asset value between the two buildings that are performing very differently, is that getting bigger, that gap?
So I'd say with the green premium, and just to kind of go back and define it, it's that increase of asset value directly related to the kind of sustainable features and energy efficiency. So I think there was some data released by KPMG saying that the funds participating with the kind of the GRESB and the kind of more sustainable metrics did outperform kind of the non-participating funds. And that's kind of with all the other parameters controlled. I think, again, you've got to take the long-term view that the kind of the criteria is not going to go anywhere. The kind of it's the impact that it's going to have on kind of the market perception of your asset, your exit strategy, the mitigation of risk, the attracting tenants. It's all got to be kind of encumbered into your view that you take of this kind of green premium, that it's kind of the only way that you're going to have that the strategy has to kind of incorporate all of these points going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Jade. Théo, I think at Deepki you did a study into the green premium, didn't you, across Europe? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, we ran a survey on this aspect to see if the market was observing kind of green premium on their assets that have an ESG and strong ESG strategy. The result was that, if I remember well, like 80% of the participants did observe a green premium on their ESG assets, and especially during the energy crisis, which make those assets super resilient during those crises that happens more and more in the coming years. So it's actually a good result, and it shows that it goes into the right direction. But what we observe today is that it's actually more than this, is that in the period of crisis, and especially right now with very high interest rates, ESG assets not necessarily have an high ESG premium, but reduce significantly the risk of bond discounting. And this is something that needs to be taken into account today. The big threat is with the bond discounting for asset manager, and ESG strategy for those assets is clearly one of the biggest guarantee to maintain their value at the end of the operation cycle. The green premium is difficult to measure today, especially because we have a cost of finance that is super high. Then we have a crisis of energy and so on. But what is really there is the fact that you reduce your risk of bond discounting with very strong ESG strategy. It's clearly there, and it's clearly the main strategy for a lot of participants today.
Thank you, Théo. Simon, we've seen recently the government push back some of its timelines for various elements of its green strategy. Do you think that when we find ourselves in difficult economic circumstances, the net zero agenda kind of slips in importance slightly, it becomes less of a priority? Or have we passed the point where, you know, everybody is fully committed and on board with this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big topic in itself, right? The whole anti-ESG agenda. And it's not just a UK thing. We've seen it, this happening across the continent in Europe. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, I think earlier this year, came out with a statement saying there needed to be a pause on regulatory measures on green. And then in Germany, we also almost saw the fall of a coalition government around kind of phasing out of boilers. So it's definitely happening across the board. But from that, and speak from the engagement that we have with the wider real estate industry and from the investors, developers, architects, designers, the progress is just as normal. A lot of it, they obviously, it's really important to take into account policy and regulation, what's happening, but a lot of the companies in the real estate sector already have a roadmap to net zero, and they're just pushing ahead. And regardless, they in a way now they see the public sector as a hindrance and a hurdle that needs to be overcome, and hopefully at some stage they'll get on board with this. Obviously, we can't deny there's economic kind of headwinds on the horizon. That's always a concern. And so every year we publish a report in partnership with PwC called Emerging Trends in Real Estate. And this surveys thousands of senior real estate professionals across the continent, looking at kind of their concerns for the years ahead. And if you look at the results from this year's one, which was published a few weeks ago, it's understandably that the key concerns are mainly macro factors. So I think around 90% of respondents state interest rates, inflation still as a concern, and also kind of economic growth prospects. So, slower growth or even recession. But then if you ask them to switch their mindset in terms of the longer term horizon, mid to longer term, it all focuses on decarbonisation and climate change risk. That rises significantly up the agenda. So while the economic slowdown is a concern, and I feel that the wider industry recognizes this is such a big and massive factor for the industry that it has to be addressed, and we need to start making that progress now. And we're starting to see it in the negative effects anyway of climate change happening in terms of the increased amount of physical risk. So over summer we saw Southern Europe suffering for a range of heat waves. We're now going into winter with increased amount of storms. This is now impacting kind of the real estate in terms of insurance premiums and lenders as well, in terms of linking it back to Théo and Jade's point in terms of banks willing to lend more for assets that meet those sustainability credentials, but also are less risky from a physical risk perspective. So the industry can't ignore this, and I don't think it's going to go away regardless of the economic situation.
Thank you, Simon. Brent, does that kind of chime with what you're experiencing when you're talking to building owners and investors? This isn't going to slip down the agenda. It's we're locked into this now.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's right, and investors sort of clearly need to take this seriously, don't they? Because as we've heard on the call, and we need to a large part, and this really isn't a new phenomenon. I think again, it will continue to progress and evolve in a certain direction. I agree, but this isn't a new thing. Asset values are being impacted. Terminal capital values. What capital are you using and at what price? As long as decarbonisation impacts those things predominantly, it's in an investor or a developer's interest to make sure they're making the right choices. I think is ultimately the bottom line, literally and metaphorically. Yeah.
Thank you, Brent. Simon, how optimistic are you about governments and real estate companies hitting their stated net zero targets?
Yeah, well, George, I didn't want to end on a downer because I was trying to to be fair, it is looking pretty grim, to be honest, like in terms of if you look at all the latest reports that come out, the UN environmental program has published a report in terms of where we are in terms of meeting the Paris Agreement. And so coming back to my first point as we open the session today, a lot of countries have agreed to the Paris Agreement of limiting emissions or the average global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. But the progress we're making is not there, and we're not meeting it. But there's some positives in terms of the attitudes that we're seeing from the wider industry. People are collaborating more. They recognize this is such an important agenda that needs to be tackled, and so coming together. So in the short term, I'd say quite pessimistic, but in the kind of mid to long term, I think I see positive stuff on the horizon. And just to highlight, I think one of the changes will be the kind of the younger generations that are up and coming now in the broader real estate sector and across our industry. The conversations I have with them, we have a network of what we call young leaders, and they're really engaged in this, and they recognize this. They're the ones that are going to be dealing with this. So I think that's a positive angle there.
I would say, just to add on to that we've kind of studies have been done as well in student accommodation and kind of the importance for students. And although it's kind of you're spending 1 to 3 years in an asset, it's a very transient period. There's still a huge impact in kind of a social awareness of their environmental footprint, their kind of use of the building, that they're kind of caring more than ever.
Yeah. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing to hear. Théo, how about you? What's your assessment?
I'll say that the chance that we have for real estate is that the roadmap is pretty clear. I mean, it's compared to other sector, we know what we have to do. We pretty much know how to do it. It's just that we know that the change is there. It's a difficult journey, but we know the roadmap. And I think that the good news, as Simon said, is that the roadmap is almost shared by every player today by the markets. It's starting to get better. So then it's just about finding the right organization scheme to support this transition, support this roadmap. And it's not something that can be dealt as a side project for those organizations, clearly not. It's a change in their organization, it's a change in their business development. But the good news is that we see good example on the market. We see good customers that have changed their whole organization to put ESG in every steps of their investment cycle, which makes it super coherent, super consistent where they address their strategy and makes them having good results. So the roadmap is clear, and we are here to help the markets. It does not mean that it will be an easy journey, clearly not. But compared to other sectors, we have this chance is that we know to address the change.
Thank you, Théo. Yeah, I think that's a good note to end it on. That, you know, it's not going to be easy, but as you say, compared with other sectors, the steps we need to take are fairly clear and obvious. So, you know, it's down to all the stakeholders to get involved and make sure we do that. Really interesting discussion. Thank you. Thanks to you all. Thanks to Brent, Jade, Simon, and Théo. Really enjoyed that. Just going to show a few slides before we wrap up. Our next Urban Living webinar is the last one of the year on the 13th of December, and we are going to be talking about 5 trends which we think will be shaping the living sector in 2024. You can register for that session using the link in the chat. Just wanted to flag up one of our events, Recharge. It moves around various European cities every year. And in January next year, we are going to be in Belfast, which is really interesting. There's loads going on there. It's right at the start of its living sector journey, actually. Really interesting city. If you'd like to find out more about that and buy tickets, you can see the link in the chat. If you'd like to work with us at IHM on our digital offers or our in-person events, get in touch with my colleague Henry, whose details are on the screen and also in the chat. I mentioned earlier we're going to leave the session open for a couple of seconds, so you can a couple of minutes, so you can take some notes from the chat. Other than that, I'd just like to say thank you. Thanks to Abode Worldwide for sponsoring. Thanks to our fantastic speakers. Thanks to you all for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.